This is Dan Elliott Transmission and Gear again. We're going to start with our assembly of our T10. I want to first thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoyed the first video, and we're going to get started on the second video. We're going to take a look at different aspects of our cleanup and assembly. We'll assemble the sub-components and then we will put the assembly together. But first we want to go back and take a look at a pickup truck that we're doing, that we're at the stage right now that it will be important to know because we changed this pickup from an automatic to a manual, and we want to make sure that all our components are working the way they're supposed to and that we don't have any leaks in our hydraulic clutch assembly. So let's go back and take a look at it, then we can come back and start on our transmission assembly. This is a 1985 Chevrolet pickup. It was an automatic. We're changing it to a manual. I think we're going to do a Tremec 5-speed because we want to overdrive in this unit. As you can tell, this is a Chevrolet crate engine. It's the 350 cubic inch, 400 horse crate engine, aluminum radiator. We did the pulley set on the front of the engine, and I wanted to show you the firewall because we want to kind of do this in an economical manner. We're not trying to be cheap, but we want to save some money. So we did the stock master cylinder that sits up on the dash for the clutch master, and then we've come off the master with a braided line that goes down to our slave unit. And I chose to use a slave unit that is relatively economical, and went to the parts store and picked out one for a early model Corvette that I think or thought would work, and we want to make sure that we have the unit it's in place, and we don't have any leaks. So that's the master, the braided line, and the master and the slave. The slave was a 1/8 pipe thread anyway, but the master was a metric, but an 1/8 inch pipe thread with a little sealer on it. Worked fine, and we're going to see if it's got any leaks. Alright, if you can see our pointer here, we're pointed at our hydraulic slave cylinder, which is against the clutch fork here, and you notice it's got an aluminum adapter. This was the only way that I could make this work with the headers that we had, and I really didn't want to cut any of the tubes of the header or do anything that would cause me a lot of extra work that I really didn't want to do. We're trying to save money and try to do this as economically as we can. So used an adapter, used a slave cylinder for an early model Corvette that was more compact than the truck unit that comes original on this 85 Chevrolet pickup. And you notice this is a Chevrolet, just a stock aluminum bell housing. We used the adapter ring that got off the internet to adapt to our front bearing retainer. You notice the fork, the hydraulic release bearing, clutch pressure plate, all the assembly is in place. All we used was the stock assembly, stock flywheel, clutch pressure plate, throwout bearing, fork. We tried to use as much as we could of the components that we already had, and once we get to this position right here, we can now fit a dummy case with an input in it, plug it in, and see if the clutch will release. We can reach inside the case and spin the front input or the input and see if the clutch releases as it should before we put a transmission in this truck. We want to make sure that all our components are working the way they're supposed to, and the clutch will release around about a half a pedal of movement before it gets to the floor. So right now we'll leave this and we'll go up and look at our dummy trans case, and I'll show you what I do when I plug those components in, and then we'll get started on our assembly. This is my two mock-up cases with inputs. Both of these will work, believe it or not, in a Chevrolet. One will work in a Ford, but both will work in a Chevrolet. This one is a Jericho. A Jericho transmission is based on the Ford top loader. This is a standard GM housing. All I've done is used a which you could do yourself. You could use your main shaft, your front bearing retainer, and put this in the case. And what we do when we get to this point, like my truck back there, since we don't know that clutch assembly will work, we're on a mock-up, so we make sure that everything works as it should. The case, everything goes into the bell housing, the throwout bearing slides over the collar, the pilot bearing goes into the back of the crankshaft and doesn't go in too deep, because that's one of the things when you get into a race application. Some of these pilots on the front of these inputs are extremely long, and if you've got a crankshaft that's drilled short in the rear where the pilot bearing goes, you can actually, this input will actually go in deep enough where it'll push against the back of the crankshaft and knock the thrust bearings out of the engine, and that's not what you want to happen. So we want to make sure that all this assembly fits in, everything fits like it should, and most of all, that your clutch works as it should. When you push the pedal down, when you depress the pedal about halfway down, you should be able to reach into this case and turn this turn the input. And what I did in the pickup truck that we're working on back there that we looked at was I used this assembly to go up into the bell housing, into the clutch, making sure that everything worked as it should. Once I put a couple of bolts in, I can then get in the truck, mash the clutch, have somebody under the bottom spin the input shaft and make sure the clutch releases as it should and we don't have any leaks in the system. Important to know before you try to put a transmission in your truck that everything works as it should. It's a whole lot easier now than it is to do it later. Another thing too, and we didn't talk about this earlier, the GM transmissions are 26 spline input, 32 spline output. They do make other inputs. They make a 10 spline. In the Fords, they do a 10 spline. They do an 1 1/8. They do an 1 3/8. But in the Chevrolet, the standard is 26 in, 32 out. And that's what we'll be talking about with the assembly that we have. But just make sure, and you can lay a straight edge along these splines to make sure that the input's not twisted. That's one thing in cleanup that we look at, is the input, and make sure that the input's not twisted, because that can happen. And if you have your clutch disc, you can slide your disc down this input and make sure it slides all the way back to the front bearing retainer, doesn't bind on anything, and it'll slide on and off easily. But this unit is my Ford unit I use for the Ford applications. But Jericho, as a lot of the race transmissions do, they have a dual pattern. Sometimes whoever uses these units will mill off the set of Ford ears on the bottom. They do that not only for clearance but for weight, but they'll mill off the bottom set of ears. The top two ears are slotted. That's how much difference there is between a Ford pattern and a Chevrolet pattern. And I'll show you in a future video what we did to a Tremec, so that I can put a Tremec in a Ford or a Chevrolet, and it doesn't really matter as long as we have the right input shaft and front bearing retainer. And that's what's important for you to know whenever you do these applications, is, like I said, you can't measure enough, because you want to make sure that you have the right front bearing retainer, right clutch disc, right pilot bearing size, and that everything fits as it should. And this is our two mock-ups. You can use your case to do that and just take the components back out when you get ready to do your assembly. But it's a lot easier to do this now than it is to wrestle with a transmission, try to get it in, or you have leaks or problems once you do get it in. What I have here is Tremec. This is a TKO 600. I've got a couple of TKO 600s and a TKO 500, and this assembly is one of them that's going to go into the truck. And we may do a tear down and assembly of one of these transmissions for a video also, and we'll get in depth on these also. And also I have on the other side over here, I've got another T10 that I just built, and this one's getting ready to ship out. It is a stock T10 243 input. a 161 123, and it's ready to ship out for a street car. And another TK under the bottom. And then here I've got a trans that I'm working on. This is a GF4A or a Tex T101A. They're both the same transmission. And before we're done, we'll do a video on the disassembly and assembly of this unit, because this unit is probably several generations down the road from a stock T10. And these units are very healthy and very race-worthy. Also, they're dog ring transmissions instead of synchronized. They're straight cut gears. And they also have an internal pump if you run road course. But these units are very streetable. They use an external shifter on the outside of the trans, just like your T10 or your Muncie. So these are very good units either for the street if you've got an engine that turns a lot of RPM and you want to be able to shift it up through the RPM. These work really well. And we're also going to talk in a future video about the GSRs that G-Force makes also, and we're also going to do a video on a install we did in a Kit Cobra. So we've got that coming. Alright, here we have our T10 transmission case, which we've cleaned up. We have looked at the threads, side cover, front bearing retainer, and the tail housing threads to make sure that we don't have to replace. But if we were to have to replace any of the threads, Helicoil makes great kits for these, and they're pretty easy to install, but it needs to be installed by somebody that's done this before and is experienced at putting the helicoils in. And also too, if you have a case that somebody has put the plug either in the bottom or the side in too deep or too many times, and it's sunk into the case to where that you can hardly get a wrench onto the outside to get it out, Helicoil does make a kit for pipe threads that you can use to thread the sides of these cases, put a helicoil in, and then the plug sticks out the side like it should. And I have used them and I have raced them and they do not leak. So these are good kits. Been with Helicoil since we were at Michigan in 1985. We were doing our lice practice. We stripped a spark plug hole, and it was the only engine that we had, so we pulled the head off, took it to the motel room, got a helicoil kit, fixed the spark plug hole, and won the race the next day. So these kits work, and they work well. Also too, on cleanup, what I use is I've seen different things used to clean these housings and to make sure that there are no nicks or burrs, because with this being aluminum, it's easy to nick these housings, or you have a burr in a certain place and the gaskets or the plates won't seal well. So I use a large file, I use a man file, and go across these cases very carefully, very smoothly, and make sure that that the surface is good and flat and there's no places on it that are burred up or have a place that might cause a leak. That's a handy item to have. Also too, I'm a believer in the magnets in the case. This is just a magnet from one of the supply stores, parts stores, and this transmission had a good bit of metal in it, small metal, but it had a good bit in it. And this transmission did not have a plug that had a magnet in it, and the transmission did not have a magnet in the floor of it. So you can do either, and they work well. Is I use the plugs that have the magnets inside, and they capture a lot of the floating particles that you don't think will harm a trans, but they will. But I use those not only in the drain plug but in the fill plug also. And a lot of these units that we raced with about the bigger magnets, and I would use one in the floor of the trans between the input gear set and between the third gear set, and I just put a bead of silicone on the magnet and glue the magnet to the floor of the transmission. And also too, I would use it in the tail housing underneath the little ledge that is in the tail housing. You can turn this upside down and glue it into place under the little ledge in the tail housing, and it will pick up anything that's in the tail housing that separates, the mid plates separate the tail housing from the trans. So you really want to have a magnet in both places. And if you're in any kind of application where it's a race application or a severe application, magnets are the best thing to have. Another thing too that you want to look at is, this is a good time to make sure, if you're assembly, if you're just putting it together, if you bought a new cluster pin or had to get a new one, you want to make sure that the pin is not longer than the main case. And this is the perfect time to do it, because you can either measure these or you can stand them up on a smooth surface and stand them up together. You want to make sure that the pin is not longer than the main case. If it is, you can grind a little bit off of, basically off of either end, but I like to do, if I'm grinding one, I like to grind it off the front, but just make sure you're correct in your measurements. You don't want to shorten it if you don't have to, and you want to make sure that the pin doesn't push through the front of the case, could interfere with the bell housing, and you want to make sure that it is all the way in the case to make sure the mid plate seals. These are definitely things to look for. And before we start our sub-assemblies, we're going to go back on the lathe and I'm going to show you how to check the run out on the main shaft. And also too, I'm going to show you on the input. The input, before we pack the needles in it, we want to make sure that the bearing, I like to have an interference or a slip fit on the front bearing. And regardless of what people tell you, these are not a slip fit. They won't just slide on. I don't care if you buy a new one. If you do find one that will, somebody has already polished this and made it where that bearing will slide on. But what I use is the lathe and some sandpaper, and really do be careful, because you could do a lot of bodily harm whenever you do this. So right now we're going to go to the lathe, check the run out on the main shaft, then we're going to sand the input and get it to where the front bearing will slide down. Alright, you can see I've got the output shaft in the lathe, but we're not going to spin the lathe. We've got it on a center at the back, we've got it on a center at the front. We want to do this because we don't know if the head on the lathe is exactly true or not. So we're trying to eliminate anything that would give us a false reading. So right now I've got it on centers, and I'm going to spin the output shaft with my fingers here at the front carefully. It's chucked in a little bit snug. We want to do that. I've got my dial indicator where the bearing runs, because this is going to give me a good idea. And if you want to check it up the shaft, you can do that and check individual gears. Usually I check mine at the bearing on the main shaft, and if it's true here, then I'm pretty true all the way up through. And right now I can turn that with my hand. And I notice once this needle gets settled, we're about 1/1000th run out, which is acceptable. Normally on a race application, I try to stay within about 3/1000ths. If it's street, I really wouldn't go over about 4 or 5/1000ths of run out, because this is really what can prematurely wear your gears out. Might even make noise if you try to use it beyond that kind of run out. But this is how you do the main shaft, and then we're getting ready to polish the main shaft. I've got a crankshaft polisher, and I'll run a quick polish on the main shaft, and then we'll get the input in, and I'll show you how to sand the input so the bearing slides onto the input. Alright, I've chucked my input into the lathe very carefully so it's not damaged the splines on the input, and I've used my crankshaft polisher, the same one you saw me use on the output shaft, and carefully polished enough off the front of this input shaft so that the bearing slides with a little bit of a snug fit. You still want it to fit snug. You don't want to take enough off of it that the bearing just falls on and off. You have to be careful at this point, if you choose to do this, on the bearing slide on and off the input. And put a drop or two of oil on the input. Give it a couple of minutes to cool, because when you're polishing this input, as anything, you're heating it up. And believe it or not, it's enough to cause a tighter interference fit. So to have a true fit, give it time enough to cool, and then that way you can come in. I've got my bearing hanging on the input, and I can slide it on and pull it onto the input, and when I get ready to take it off, I can just push it forward and pull the bearing off. That is, to me, a perfect fit of the bearing, and that's what I like to do. Then that way I can assemble this without doing any damage to my blocking rings or gears or case. Alright, you can see I've already got my cluster loaded with the tube, the 3 spacers on one end with the 2 rows of needle bearings, same on the other end. So in the front of the cluster tube you have 3 small spacers, a tube, 3 spacers in the other end, 2 rows of bearings in the front, 2 rows of bearings in the rear. And what's important is, if this assembly was already together, I still like to check this and make sure that my links are right inside this tube, inside the cluster, because you want to make sure that this spacer doesn't stick out of the cluster on either end. You want it to be recessed back up into the cluster. And the way to do that is, the way I do it is, I measure my tube, which was a 4.565. I have 6 rows of the spacers, which are 70 thousandths, that's 420 thousandths. I have 4 rows of needles, which are 738. And you need to mic yours. You need to make sure, because this is not a standard measurement, and you're going to run into all different kind of combinations. My loaded assembly came up to be 7.937. I know my cluster tube, I measured it, and it is 7.990. So I have 53 thousandths of clearance, which is what I need to make sure that the spacers, needles don't get pinched into the cluster tube and burn up prematurely. Also too, keep in mind that if you buy a kit, make sure that your spacer rings are the same thickness as yours, because they do come in different thicknesses. A lot of people don't know this. So if you mic this ring, it's about an 87 thousandths. You mic another ring, it's about 85. You mic another ring, and it's about a 68. So I know from the transmissions that I've rebuilt, I've seen these range anywhere from 60 to 65 thousandths to 90 thousandths thick. So make sure, if you're rebuilding your trans, that your stack assembly is shorter than what your cluster tube is. And if you have to, which I've done before, you can put these in the lathe and carefully turn off a little bit of the thickness of this tube. Just make sure that you don't take too much off. About a 50 thousandths clearance is what I look at, but as long as you have clearance, you should be good. Also too, I've used my lithium grease, which I said lithium grease, so why lithium grease or Vaseline? Any assembly lube, it doesn't have to be just this, any assembly lube that has a low temp melt away works good. But I've already packed the needles in the input and getting it ready to put into our assembly once we get started. We have our main case and the fixture. It's cleaned up. We've looked at all our bolt holes. Our threads look good. We don't see anything about them. We've looked at the side cover. We looked at the threads in the tail housing. Everything looks good. We've run a file over our surface before we mounted it up. We ran a file on the side cover and the tail. Made sure everything was true like it should be. Now we're looking at the front of the case, And you notice that the drain hole for the front seal is in the bottom. That is where it's very important that we notice the alignment to where that we can match the area in the front bearing retainer and put it where the drain hole is. There are transmissions that keep you from misaligning this, but this particular unit, you can orient this hole or this drain back anywhere you want to put it. And this one is in the bottom. You want to make sure that your slot is toward the bottom whenever you put your front bearing retainer on. Also too, I have made me a tool. The seals on these, this one I'm not going to replace because it's been replaced not long ago. It's very soft and pliable, and that's what you need to look at. But if you're in a unit, you don't know anything about it, go ahead and flip it out. And I've made a tool to make installation so much easier in these things. This is a new seal, and this is how it fits the tool, and makes installation a lot easier. And I have an arbor press, and I just use that. It presses down, and once it bottoms, then it stops along the outside edge. It's just some of those little things that if you don't have, makes the installation of this seal a lot harder. You can do damage to the seal. And you do want to, I don't recommend that you hammer any seal in when you can press it in, and you can press it in without doing a lot of damage. I've got a small arbor press, but if I do have to use a tool to put this in with a hammer, I do put the assembly lube around the seal area between the outside lip of the seal and the inside, so that there's no danger in the spring. And you'll notice the spring on the inside of the seal, there's no danger in that seal popping out, because I've seen that before. And also too, when you buy a new seal, make sure that that spring is there when you purchase a seal. There are some seals that do not require a spring, but all the ones I've ever seen on the input has a spring. So if you buy one, the spring's not there, you want to question whoever you're buying it from to make sure that the seal does or does not need a spring. So that's just some of the little things that helps me assemble these transmissions and keep from damaging any components. Another thing we're going to look at is, this is our cluster shaft pin. I've polished it with my crankshaft polisher, and we want to make sure that the pin will not drop into the hole in the front. It should be a press in fit in the front and a press in the rear, because if you mark these pins are the same dimension all the way down the shaft. They're about this one's about a 992 until you get to the back, and the back of these pins where the Woodruff key is a couple of thousandths larger diameter. That allows you to slide the pin into the case, and it will press into the front and press into the rear. And the rear of this is about a 995, so we're about 3 thousandths bigger, and this is just this pin, so it can vary some few thousandths, but it should press in on both ends. Also keep in mind that you'll find this is an older case that I have. This one is out of, actually it's out of one of the cars that we bought from Penske back in the mid 70s, and a lot of the gear sets that were made for the Borg Warners, these transmissions came in Shelby's and other performance Ford cars, nickel gears, and they take a smaller cluster pin than any of the later stuff. That was what they did in the later years. They made this pin diameter larger. So you got to make sure that you have the correct components whenever you get into these things, and make sure that everything that you're doing, you have the right components to put it together and you don't have any issues. But this is actually it bolts into a Ford, made for a Ford, bolts into a Ford, and it is just a T10. During the time that they were doing a lot of the top loaders for the Fords, They ran out of transmissions because they had so much demand for the units, so they worked with Borg Warner and used some of their units in some of the early performance cars until they could get stock back on their top loaders. Alright, right now we've got the rear of the transmission case, and you'll notice the area at the rear of the case, the material, and how this is the area that a lot of people have problems with the gasket coming out between the mid plate and the tail housing. And this is an area where you have a long space that has not a lot of support. Well, Doug Nash came in and designed the 4+3 for the Corvettes. Well, he did something else that was very useful for us that race these units, is he produced a case that had extra material at the bottom and had another ear at the top. And you notice in this case it used a stock mid plate that did not have provision for the extra hole at the bottom or the top. And this mid plate is a cast mid plate, and the best I can tell by the stamping numbers, this may be a Chrysler mid plate, because most of these units that were produced aluminum had aluminum mid plate. So I questioned it a little bit whenever I saw the cast, and I believe this one's out of a Chrysler, Dodge Chrysler. And showing the area here at the bottom and the difference between these two cases, and the mid plate that was used for the units to be able to utilize the bottom and the top hole. The top hole was not as important as the bottom because the gasket had problems at the bottom, not as much as at the top. This is a mid plate that was used on a trans that didn't have the extra hole, but was made for one to be able to utilize this bottom hole, had no provision for the top one. It was just a cast mid plate that was done by somebody later that you could utilize this mid plate and drive. I put this aluminum plug in so I could use it on a regular case, but all I've got to do is drive this plug out, use a center punch, and then drill and thread the hole at the bottom, and then I've got a heavy duty mid plate that will actually beef up the bottom of this case and make it to where it's a stronger unit, and also too it won't kick the gasket out of the bottom of this. But as you notice with gaskets, we had to have a gasket made for the extra bolt hole, because these two gaskets, one is for a stock transmission, one is for a modified billet mid plate. And you notice the extra hole at the bottom, the extra hole at the top, because they would come in later and make a case and a tail housing that had the extra bolt hole in it for racing. And if you put this gasket on, you can see where the hole would need to be drilled in the bottom and where it would need to be drilled and tapped on the top also. This is the billet mid plate that would come later, that you would be able to use top hole and bottom hole. And this is a billet mid plate. It's made out of aluminum and it's a stronger piece, and it was designed to work with this heavy duty main case that was done specifically for racing. It was done by G&G Transmissions, and this main case is what we raced. This one has 10/29/87 on it, and that was the year that this main case came out. I think we raced it first at Daytona in 1987, and then we used it for the most part all season long. But it was a much beefier main case. It's just next generation from a stock main case. But not only was it a beefier unit, it was also a unit that allowed you to use a longer cluster, a different input that was nickel, and a cluster that was nickel that was a little bit longer, had a little bit wider first gear, and it was made to where that you could bolt it into a Ford or a Chevrolet application. And a lot of components were made for these units that are hard to find today. You don't find many pieces anymore. But if you have one of these and it's currently running, you have a nice piece, because these were heavy transmissions. They were good transmissions and produced specifically for racing. But that was the mid plate that was used with them. And then they made a tail housing that was made specifically for racing that had no provision for a speedometer. This one was made by Richmond. G&G was the first one I saw that did these. Has the shifter in the same location, but this one is magnesium. It's very beefy, has a lot more material in it. The stock tail housing's cracked around through the speedometer hole in a race application. This tail housing took care of that, and you no longer had the tapered pin through the side. This one actually used the diff bolt out of a conventional rear end of a Chevrolet vehicle. So these units were a whole lot better, and they completed this application of the extra bolt at the bottom and the extra bolt hole at the top. On cleanup of these assemblies, I like to use a razor blade. You can use a scraper, or you can use a razor blade inside the scrapers. Either one works equally well. I love to use a razor blade, but you have to be careful with a razor blade that you don't nick or get into the aluminum whenever you're peeling the gaskets off, because some of these gaskets are pretty hard and they're sealed real good and they stick extremely well to the housing. So when you do these, you have to be extremely careful not to pick in or gouge into the aluminum. And a lot of times I'll use a scraper and scrape as much of the gasket off as I can. Then I'll put it in the wash tank and let it soak for a couple of hours, come back and do the same thing, or use the razor blade and try to peel other layers of the gasket off and come back, let it soak a little bit more. I give it a little bit of time so that it's easier to remove the gaskets and you don't gouge into the material, because on the aluminum, if it was cast or steel, it would work extremely well to use a razor blade and you wouldn't gouge into. But it's easy to do on the aluminum. You just have to be careful and take your time. But whatever method you use on that, main thing is that you don't gouge the aluminum material, because it makes sealing these things a lot harder. Alright, this is our side cover assembly. We've already cleaned it up. I've run my file across the surface where the gasket goes on, along with where the machining is, where the shift cams go through. We've got it clean. We pulled the seals out of the other side, because this one has got, some have shift cams with O-rings on the cams. Others have seals in the edge of the plates. This one has the seals in the edge of the plates. And this particular side cover had seals that had rubber sides, as opposed to a seal that has a steel side. And I much prefer the ones that have the steel side as I do the rubber ones. The rubber ones can pop out easier, and I like the ones that have the steel sides. They stay in and they seem to seal better, as experienced over the years. They also have a lip on the outside that keeps any dust or debris from getting into the shift cam, thus keeping it very protected. But I also made a little tool to install these with, because I found over time that trying to hammer these in or press these in, making a little tool makes it a whole lot easier to do, and you don't damage the seal near as badly. I just made it where it fit inside the cover and went down and contacts the outside so that you know that's the stop. And of all the things that normally I do, this is probably one time that with this tool I can use a hammer. Otherwise, I'm going to try to use something to press these in lightly. But with this, I can hammer these in. They don't have a spring on the inside of them, they just have a rubber lip. So these can go in fairly easy. And what I do is just put it down on a surface where you've got good support under the bottom, and then I will tap it in. And you can hear it bottom out. And I do it lightly, but it makes a nice fit whenever you can put it in with this tool, as opposed to just trying to put one in. This is the other end of the plate. And that part is done. Once we do that, we have seals in nice and flat and flush and bottomed out into the bottom of the side cover. At this point in time, I like to put a little oil inside where the cams go through. Use my finger to go in to make sure the oil is all the way around the side cover. And at this time, the side cover, this end is first, second, this end is third and fourth, and the cams sit to where the forks go in the top side. So I can mount this into my vise. I put the inspect the cam, and one thing about the cams that I like to show you is you have here a shift cam where the threads have been wrung off of the cam, and what has happened is these slots, if you don't line this up to where this shift lever sits flat, and a lot of these are extremely tight where you have to pull them into place. It's hard to get in and file these and open them up. I've had to do it in the past, but it's hard to do. But you want to make sure that the flats and the alignment is perfect before you start pulling this on. Otherwise, you're going to wring the threads off of your shift cams, and then you'll just have to throw them away. But be very careful when you install your shift levers that the alignment is correct before you start pulling them in place. And if they're too tight, try to get a file inside these and open them up a little bit where they will start on easier and pull on a little bit easier. But I will oil the cam, and I'll oil where the detents are. Make sure we've got oil on everything. This is the 3/4 cam. I want to put the 1/2 cam in first. It's just my preference. You can do it however way you want to do it, whatever's easier for you. This is just my preference because I can do it here, and I know this end of the side cover is the 1/2 end. So I'll put that cam in, and I'm very careful when I go through the seal not to damage the seal. At this time, I've got my spacer tube, the large tube part of it. I'll oil it, drop it into the bore. I can put a detent ball in, my spring, my interlock pin, very important, and then the other detent ball. At this time, I can get my other cam, and with my finger I can push down on the detent ball and slide that into place very carefully. Sometimes you have to rotate as you install this thing to make sure that you don't damage the seal, but it'll go into the seal and it's into place. Alright, this assembly is done. We're going to lay it in the tray, and I'm going to put it into neutral, and that's the orientation of the side cover and the cams. And this assembly is ready to put on after we get our trans assembled. Alright, the next thing I want to show you is the synchronizer assemblies and the different things that you may run into whenever you get into these assemblies. I have taken a little bit of material off the top of the inner hub for 3/4. I did that to clearance since we're in a racing application for this one. I took about 10 thousandths off of this, which will allow 10 thousandths clearance or so for third gear on the main shaft. But we will start with these hubs. This particular hub, the stock hubs, and I'll show you the different hubs that you're going to run into. This particular hub, if you notice the difference on the inside of it, if you can see the groove on the inside, it's a smaller ring groove, and the ones that's in our transmission is a wider groove. You may find either one of these assemblies in your transmission. Either one are fine. You just want to make sure that you have the correct keys that go with these hubs, because they are different. Normally with the single narrow groove, it's a hollow key, and it usually has a round retaining ring for the keys, the spring. Normally it's round for this one, normally. You'll see a lot of different things, but this is usually the ring you'll see with a hollow key. Our particular synchronizer assembly has a solid key, and it has a wider flat on the top of it, as you notice, to fit the wider slot in this slider hub. Also too, you'll notice that the springs for these is a flat spring. It's not a round spring, it's a flat spring. And these keys will sit down below the surface of the hub just a little bit, and the springs will hold them out into place against the slider. I'm going to show you also too the difference in sliders, because we chose a different slider for this one, because this one has the stock sliders, and the stock sliders are straight. As you notice by this straight edge, those slots on the sliders, those slots there on the outer hub, are straight through. They're just straight on both sides, with the slot, the notch in the middle for the keys. But what happens with these over time, either the gear wears a little bit, where the synchro teeth are, or these sleeves wear just a little bit, and they will come out of gear when you're decelerating mostly. You'll notice that you'll go down the road, you'll downshift into second, and then it'll just come out of gear. Replacing these sleeves will sometimes fix the problem. Most of the time they won't, but they came up with a slider sleeve that is a tapered, and you'll see this. It's got a back cut in it down about 3/8 of an inch, to where that these sliders bite themselves into gear. So if you've got an issue with a gear or an input being worn a little bit and it is coming out of gear, usually, like I say, usually on a downshift, not normally on upshift, but it could happen on upshift, but this is the slider sleeve that you need to get. They either call this a back cut or a hook slider, and that's what we're going to use in this transmission. And I use them in all the transmissions that I overhaul, because usually if you don't have a problem with it jumping out of gear, at some point in time you're probably going to have that problem. Now, I wanted to also show you a synchronizer assembly that is a road race, has road race Bryce. And this particular Bryce is different from our stock Bryce, because this one has a slot on the outside, and it doesn't have the regular Bryce that is in our transmission that has a slot in it. This road race Bryce is a lot stronger than the stock Bryce that has a slot in it, because over time this Bryce could break, especially if you have hard shifting, or you get yourself in a situation to where that you downshift hard, upshift hard, you could break this Bryce. But the road race Bryce is what I recommend that you use in any of these T10s. I love this Bryce because normally you don't have any problem whatsoever with it, but you have to buy the inner hub that gives you that assembly, because you have a different key. The spring is the same, but the key is different. It's wider about the same length, but it's a wider key, fits bigger slots so that it can fit the slots with the Bryce. But if you see this is road race Bryce, and if you're ordering components after you've torn your transmission apart and you see that it has this wide key and this Bryce, then you will have to order road race Bryce. This is just the standard Bryce. This is the road race Bryce. And when you order a new transmission from Richmond, you can order an option. There are several options you can order actually. One is a billet front retainer. Another option is a roller bearing main shaft where the thing has roller bearings all down the main shaft. You can also get an option with the road race Bryce. You can also get an option to where, and I highly recommend that you do this if you're in an application to where that you want these things to shift really well. You can ram or polish these assemblies, the inner hub, the outer sleeve. You can polish these, but you can also, if you order a new Richmond transmission, you can order an option that is a complete rammed, where they ram the speed gears, the cluster, the input, and the sliders and the hubs, to where these assemblies are extremely smooth operating and smooth shifting, and also too the gears are polished to where that they have a really slick surface, and to me they will last a lot longer. We have raced the rimmed transmissions for 20 years now and had extremely good luck with those. They last well and they do well, so I recommend that you do that if you have one. And there is another Bryce that you might run into that is not commonly found, but it's what they call banded Bryce. It's your standard synchronizer Bryce ring with a steel band around the Bryce. It's machined down, has a steel band on it, and this keeps you from breaking the stock Bryce. But these are extremely expensive, and I don't know many people that even do this process anymore. And the road race Bryce is just as strong to me and reliable and a cheaper cost. So if you're going to look at doing this, I recommend the road race Bryce. And but just some of the things you may see when you tear your transmission apart, then you'll know what you've got is the banded Bryce, and know that you probably may not be able to find it anymore. Alright, we're going to continue with our assembly of our 3-4. We're going to do our 3-4 assembly first. I'm going to get these pieces out of the way. This is our stock slider sleeve. We're not going to use it. We're going to use the hook slider or the back cut slider. And what I do is get my pieces together. These were all display. Get these out of the way. Alright, we've got our inner hub, outer sleeve, our keys, and our springs. Alright, what I normally do is oil the inside of my slider sleeve really good. I'll put it right there to stay in place. I'll oil the inner hub where the splines are for the sleeve. I'll put my keys in the hub. Alright, and the orientation is very important on this. For the 3-4 assembly, this will be the top. This will be the side against third gear, but this is the top of the sleeve as it is on the main shaft. And we want the taper to be to the front of the transmission. and it'll be just like this. Then we'll put our springs in. That's one side. And I just flip it straight over because I want that gap to be the same. This is the way I've done it. This is the way I've raced them for years, and it's worked extremely well. But I'll put the gap on the same side on both sides. And this assembly is complete. And we're going to lay it in the tray, but the orientation is that the taper goes to the front. This will be to the front of the transmission, and the taper on the 3/4 is to the front. Alright, this is our 1-2 assembly. This is our stock sleeve. We're replacing it. This is our hook slider sleeve. We'll oil this one. I've got my keys and springs. I've inspected these keys and springs and they look good. I'm not going to replace them, but they look really good. The orientation on this one is this flat is to the rear. This is where the first gear sleeve will come down and contact the inner hub. And I want the slider to the taper to be toward the back on the 1-2. I'll slide my sleeve over this, hold my keys in place with my hand. I'll put my spring in. And I'll turn it over. I'll put my spring in the same way. You can put the springs in opposite of each other. You can put them in the same way. I've raced them either way, and I've not had any issues with the orientation of the springs. So whichever way that you want to do, you can do that. This is just the way I do it. And the assembly slides good, works good. And we can put this into the tray. We're done with this assembly. But orientation is the flat goes to the back of the trans, the taper goes to the back. So we've got our orientation correct for our 1-2 synchronizer assembly. Alright, if you'll take a look at what we've got in the tray. Whenever you do these assemblies, you want to have I try to keep everything in order as I pull it out so that I know exactly how it came apart and how it needs to go back together. If it's a situation where somebody's brought me a transmission and it's already in pieces, I'll try to clean up everything, lay it out in order, and I'll assemble it before I glue up the gaskets and put it together completely finished. I do that so I make sure that the clearances are correct and everything, because I don't know anything about it, and I want to make sure that I've got everything exact and in order, and that the clearances end up being the way they need to be. If everything looks good on my mock-up, then I'll pull it back apart, glue it together, and be done. Final assembly. But I've got my side cover, my forks, mid plate, tail, cluster, thrust washers, cluster pin. I've got 2 washers here, thrust washers for first gear. And what I do on the thrust washers for first gear to clearance these is I have a surface grinder that's got a magnetic base, and I usually can take a little bit of material off of the thrust washer so as to clearance first gear. So I take about 10 thousandths off of this thrust washer for first gear. This is the stock one. This is one I've turned about 10 thousandths off of. And this goes between the snap rings and the first gear, or between the bearing and first gear, and when I clearance this, it allows me to open up the gap a little bit where first gear can oil a little bit better. I like to do that. Alright, I've got my input front bearing retainer, I've got the snap ring and the spacer washer that goes in the front. I've got everything together, my bolts for the front bearing retainer, my two bearings, which this bearing will need to go here, and at this time I can show you the difference in bearings also. This bearing is what they call a max type bearing, because if you notice, this bearing has a lot more balls in the center of this thing than this bearing does. This is a standard bearing. This is a max type. And normally if a little bit extra money for the max type, but what I normally do is use the max type on the input because it's the one that's going to turn the most RPM or be abused the hardest. And then I use my regular bearing at the mid plate. Alright, I've got my speed gears with the Bryce laid out. My synchronizer assemblies in the order that they go in. My first gear, all the reverse cam, reverse fork, the bearing, the bolts are clean. We're ready for this assembly, and we can get into that shortly. But the main thing is to lay everything out, keep it clean, keep it in a place that you can keep up with everything, to know how it goes back in, how you took it apart. I've got my snap rings in the place they came apart in. This is the ones for the tail, or the mid plate. These are the ones for the front at third gear, and then these are the ones for the input. So he's got everything laid out. Next thing that we're going to do is start our assembly.